Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on migrants and refugees facing COVID-19 in the UK and globally. The webinar is being hosted by the Interdisciplinary Global Development Center, also known as IGDC, at the University of York. My name is Jessica Mukuti, and I am a postdoctoral researcher for IGDC. IGDC is an interdisciplinary learning and research community for equitable global development based at the University of York. IGDC undertakes interdisciplinary research with a particular focus on social justice, global health, and sustainable environments. We also offer undergraduate and postgraduate academic programs in development. The center brings together researchers from across the humanities and social and natural sciences within the University of York and globally. We encourage researchers to work with one another and with policymakers and practitioners to address global development challenges. Today's webinar is the 6th in IGDC's COVID-19 webinar series. The series explores different facets of the pandemic and how they relate to policy and research needs in global development. The series features invited speakers presenting case studies from across the world to reflect on the impact from and responses to the pandemic. And we will be asking how global development researchers can contribute to a better understanding of the impact of COVID-19 and reducing the likelihood and impact of future pandemics. Today's webinar is organized by IGDC in partnership with the University of York's Migration Network. It is funded by the ESRC as part of the ESRC Festival of Social Sciences, which promotes engagement between social scientists and academic groups and stakeholders. Before we start, I'd like to mention some key housekeeping rules. One is technical support. We have a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen that you can use to put up questions for the speakers. If you're having any technical issues, you can also use the chat function on the somewhere on your screen, which will be addressed by our host, IGDC webinar host. And so if you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A section, and any technical issues, please put it in the chat. We have, if you have preference for Twitter, you can find us at IGDC_York and tweet using the hashtag IGDC webinar. And now I'd like to introduce our chair for today's webinar. Our chair is Dr. Sara de Jong. She is a lecturer of politics at the University of York and one of the chairs of the York Migration Network. She conducts research on the claims for protection and rights by Afghan and Iraqi locally engaged civilians who have worked for Western military forces and development organizations, as well as on the activities and strategies of their supporters. Her broad research interests include the role of brokers in colonial and contemporary unequal encounters and the politics of NGOs in migration, gender, and development. And so please join me in welcoming Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you so much for this introduction. It's great to have so many people here. And so Jessica and I have been introduced, and of course I will introduce all the speakers to you in the audience in a moment. But we just want to do a very quick poll among the audience to get a sense of where people are tuning in from, to indicate where you're based and what your background is. I will do the same myself. And then we will get a sense of who we're actually speaking to, because of course, if we would have been in a room together, we would have seen each other, and now we don't. I do hope that we get to know each other more in the Q&A. So as Jessica said, this is a session today on migrants and refugees facing COVID-19, UK and global concerns. And the speakers today represent an incredible geographical spread, but are also all people who are academics as well as activists. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing their perspectives. And I'm sure we will develop a very nuanced and complex account of the ways in which migrants and refugees are affected by COVID-19, but also how we can struggle to uphold the rights of migrants and refugees in pandemic context. So we have two questions today that we will be going through. and then I will open it up for Q&A. I will introduce the speaker before they will start speaking, otherwise you'll hear so much information at the same time about this incredible speaker. So let me first introduce question number one. And question number one is, in what ways has COVID-19 impacted migrants and refugees movements and also governmental responses to migrants and refugees? My proposal would be to first give the floor to Pia Riggirozzi. She's a professor of global politics at the University of Southampton in the UK. Her research focuses on the political economy of development, human rights, as well as regional governance in Latin America. She's currently working on a big ESRC, GCRF, and an MRC funded project, which is about gendered health inequalities, poverty, and the challenges of inclusive development in Latin America. So Pia, I would like to invite you to respond to the question first, please.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, IGDC in general. Great to be here. I know that we have 5 minutes, so I will make 2 points to respond to question one. These points are based on the research that we are doing together with Adriana and other colleagues in the 2 main south-south corridors of migration related to Central America to Mexico and from Venezuela to Colombia and Brazil. And my 2 points refer to these. The first one to the profound impact on migrants and refugees' health and access to healthcare services. We know that accessing healthcare in normal times is already a major issue for migrants and refugees, particularly forced migrants. And in times of pandemics, this is even worse. For many of these displaced people, either during displacement or in places of abode, COVID reduced access to healthcare, either because of shortage of supplies, medicines, healthcare, specialized healthcare workers, or because resources are actually redirected in times of crisis in ways that reflect political priorities rather than the needs and the rights of the displaced people. And in Latin America, this particular situation is even worse because the health needs of migrants and their rights actually meet already fragile and underfunded health systems. And all this is particularly significant for displaced women and girls who often rely on relief and humanitarian organizations and protection services for accessing gender-based violence, counseling, sexual and reproductive health information and services, HIV and sexual transmitted infection tests, contraception, abortion, and healthcare in general. So that's my first point. There's a big problem of access to healthcare and recognition of priorities that affect particularly displaced women and girls. And the second point relates to the national migration policies and nationalism that is leading to a race to a bottom. Pandemics and health crises in general play a crucial role in reconfiguring national health regulations and entitlements, as well as border migrants, border regimes. I'm sure my colleagues will talk about that later. But migrants and refugees not only have being framed as causes of transboundary spread of this virus, but also face public health exception clauses related to migration status and national and international instruments that have been used to block their entry, suspend asylum processes, trigger deportations. All these have had an incredible effect, not only on the people displaced, but also reversing cycles of migration, sending back these people to places that are already hugely affected, not only because of COVID, but also for the same reasons that they departed from in the first place. So those 2 points I wanted to make just to start this conversation. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm also thanking Pia for bringing in gender, which of course further complicates the way in which we look at the position of migrants and refugees facing COVID-19. I'm going to invite Adriana to speak, so let me just introduce her. Dr. Adriana Marcela Velasquez Morales is a researcher at the Latin American Faculty of Social Science, also known as FLASCO in Honduras. She has published in the fields of social inclusion, inequality, international migration, and development. She's been involved in various projects, and she's currently also involved in the ERCC-funded project that Pia is leading, which is indeed this international and interdisciplinary research project that addresses the rights and needs of displaced women and adolescent girls from Central America and Venezuela. Adriana has worked for a number of think tanks. I'm just going to mention a few: UNDP, UNFPA, also for Flasco El Salvador. And in 2017, she was also invited by the UN to act as an expert for Latin America and the Caribbean on migration and development for the Global Compact for Safe and Orderly and Regular Migration, which I'm sure many of you know about. Adriana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I speak slowly because my English is not very excellent. So in this case, I focus in the situation of northern corridor of Mesoamerica that are a structure of migration to United States from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico. And in this photography, the impact of COVID, there are complex and diverse, but in this case, I will focus only in two change of impact that are relevant of the links between pre-existing conditions and government response to the crisis and their implication of the present and future of migration issues from a right perspective. So the first change of impact refers to the increase of the vulnerability of migrant population. Because the limited of time, I only focus on three tendencies. The first one is unexpected rise of the cost of the migrant project and problems to get a job for obtaining more resources. Two, lack of access to quality housing option. Three, problems to guarantee the physical and mental health of migrants. And this situation, there exists because the cost of migration project rose for the extension of the transit stage. This situation has particularly affected asylum seekers. The time they must wait for a resolution has been delayed by the temporal cancellation of government services. In addition, the situation have affected migrants who were in the middle of the road and interrupted the trip as a result of social distancing measures. In this context, the migrants have need more resources for life and to pay the cost of this life, but have problems to get a temporary job in the economic crisis. The situation is more serious in the case of migrants who traveling with economical dependent people. As a part of social distancing measure, different houses for migrants were closed at the first initial time of the quarantine, and later the level of overcrowding was more controlled by different authorities. This situation left the poorest migrants without housing option, so they don't have money to rent a place. So there are increase of migrant informal settlements with a lack of basic sanitary conditions. In parallel, there are overcrowding situations in detention centers in Mexico and United States for the reduction of the frequency of the shipments of deported population. In general terms, migrants have problems to access basic biosecurity supplies for the prevention of COVID. Vulnerable people such as pregnant women, early childhood, or people with chronic disease have difficulties to access to a regular follow-up of medical services. The different health centers have become center of contagions. There are no resources for home visit or digital attention, especially for migrants. In addition, they are exposed to different situations of violence in overcrowded centers or in informal settlements. The situation has generated different tense situations of the mental health of the migrants, but the psychological support, they are not adjusted yet. There all the deprivation of income, housing, and health can affect in the life path of the migrant generation, and the impact can be of a long term. So we need to check this not only in this moment, because the last years is the most different years is important. The second change of impact is related to the closing of borders with the construction of a governmental response based in two characteristics. The first one is the relevance of unilateral response to the crisis, despite the fact that COVID is a global problem. And the two is the association of the health management with border security. This response have brought different problems of migrant population. For example, the government response have focused on the population in the national territory. The migrant population abroad is not a priority, so there are not programs of humanitarian assistance, for example, for Salvadorian, Honduran, and Guatemalan people that there are in Mexico or United States in vulnerability crisis of their human rights. There are not exist an effective cooperation framework between countries of origin, transit, destination, and return based on migrants' needs. The most cooperation is more related to deportation flights.
Mm-hmm.
Initially, the governmental adopt protocols for the reception of returning people based on health stigmatization, like migrants equal virus. So these have these in words the process of inclusion that returning people has in the country of origin.
Thank you so much, Adriana. I think you have flagged up in a very justified way that, of course, everything that happens already also resonates with pre-existing conditions for migrants, and also that indeed it has long-term impacts. And I know some of the issues that you address, such as accommodation, border policies, will be picked up by some of the subsequent speakers, so that's great. I would like to give the floor next to Emilia Arnold-Fernandez, who is the president and CEO of Asylum Access. She's a social entrepreneur and human rights pioneer. Under Emily's leadership, the organization Asylum Access has become the preeminent global refugee human rights organization, which works on dismantling barriers to economic and civic participation for over 1 million refugees to date. Asylum Access, some people might be interested in that, has also recently published a Spanish language report on the effects of COVID-19 on migrants and refugees in Mexico. She's also a scholar, and Emily writes and teaches regularly at institutions including Stanford University, University of York, and University of London. Her accolades include the prestigious Alexander and Grinnell Prizes, Mexico's Equality and Non-Discrimination Award, and I like this one, recognition by the Dalai Lama as one of 50 unsung heroes of compassion that she received in 2009, among others. Emily, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. And I second and lift up the challenges. You asked, how has COVID impacted the movements of refugees and migrants and government responses? And certainly there is a lot of negative to talk about. So border closures and the denial of asylum, the denial of even access to asylum proceedings, detention and deportation in ways that may not be fully legal or may be legalized through emergency measures that are taken ostensibly in response to the pandemic. Movement control orders within countries that make it very difficult for refugees and other people on the move to access humanitarian assistance, life-saving healthcare, and other immediate needs, either through criminalization of movement or through unjust application of laws that do have exceptions for life-saving movement, but are not applied in that way to refugees and migrants. So we've certainly seen a lot of negative impacts everywhere that Asylum Access works. And we work intensively in Mexico, as well as in Thailand and Malaysia. And then we work in partnership with national NGOs in the Middle East and are just starting in East Africa. And so we've seen these problems throughout the places that we work, and also throughout the places that some of our peer NGOs working on refugee human rights do their work across, particularly across the global South, so across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. At the same time, I think we've seen some bright spots, if you will, not enough to dismantle the negative or counterbalance the negative impacts, but some bright spots that I think we can build on. And one of those is that I think there's been a growing recognition in many places in the world that refugees serve as essential workers. And in particular, refugees and migrants are often working in food supply related jobs, in part because of the low barrier to entry for agricultural work. But even beyond agricultural work in all aspects of the food supply chain, we've seen that refugees and migrants are in many places a significant portion of the workforce, and have been important in ensuring that the food supply chain continues even as the economy and the movement of people is more constrained. We've also seen that refugees are serving as essential workers in providing medical support, both in national healthcare systems and also in serving their own communities, whether formally or informally, to ensure that people have access to medical care during the pandemic, to ensure that medical information, health information is shared, to serve in public health roles, again, formally and informally. So Asylum Access, for example, has had community workers or members of the refugee community that are connected with us who have found themselves serving as humanitarian aid distributors, as doctors or nurses or medical advisors when they have some previous medical expertise from their home countries. And that's in addition to the formal role that refugees and migrants may play when they've been able to get past the certification challenges and become a part of a national healthcare system. The other thing that I think we've seen, and this is unsurprising probably in light of a pandemic, is that both we see governments using this opportunity in a negative sense to impose restrictions that they might not otherwise be able to impose, or to take illegal or quasi-legal action that would be harder to take if people were moving more freely, if people if there was more sunlight, if you will, on government action. But we've also seen that governments are understanding in a very visceral way, in a way that they didn't understand before, that when you exclude migrants and refugees from your health systems, when you detain migrants and refugees in unsanitary conditions, that this creates tremendous problems, not just for that community of people who may not be a priority for governments, but also for the host communities, for the entire population of a country. And so I'll just highlight one really significant success that we have seen, and it's still being hard fought, but in Mexico, we, through the activism of Asylum Access and a number of other civil society organizations, we were able to secure a judicial order that said to the Mexican government, you can't detain people who are at particular risk of COVID-19, and the people you do detain need to be kept safe from the virus. And if you can't keep them safe, then you're violating this order. And so the Mexican government did release refugees from detention on a temporary basis. And there's an opportunity there to make that potentially a permanent change, and to say, we actually don't need detention as a response to people who are seeking asylum. And so that and some other bright spots that we've seen, I think, have really shown us that there might be some opportunity in the middle of the challenges of the pandemic.
Great, Emily, thank you so much. I think we all need bright spots at this particular time. And at the same time, you've also shown to us, of course, that political accountability is often failing in times of exception, when exception can be used to justify new political measures. So our next speaker, and I think move region slightly here, is Nivni Bryan. She coordinates the Transnational Institute's War and Pacification Program, which examines the permanent state of war and pacification of resistance. And as part of this work, Niv has coordinated the research of TNI's Border War series since 2018, specifically looking at border dynamics, including externalization policies, the concept of border walls, the role of corporate actors, and the criminalization of migrant solidarity. Prior to joining TNI, Neve was based in Latin America, where she analyzed armed conflict, violence, the protection of human rights defenders, and peace building. She holds an LLM, so that's a legal qualification in international human rights law from the Irish Centre for Human Rights at the National University in Ireland, Galway. Neve, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Sara, for inviting us, and thanks also to IGDC and to York University. I think, unfortunately, following Emily's presentation, mine is not going to be so positive. But yeah, I'll hopefully be able to sum up in the 5 minutes that I have some main points around policies that we've noticed changing with regard to COVID-19. Maybe first start out by saying that border policies were already particularly dark and deadly prior to COVID-19. And I think what we've seen in our research is an entrenchment of those policies and a doubling down on behalf of governments on border policies in a particularly negative way and with a negative impact for people on the move. So I'd like to focus on 4 brief points with regard to border policies and then 4 more general points. And if I'm going over time, you can intervene, of course. So first I wanted to mention restrictions on movement. So the closing of borders, while it seems logical and indeed necessary to stop the spread of a global pandemic in some ways, and that movement should be restricted, of course, that doesn't play out in the same way when you're talking about restricting people's movements. If they're fleeing a violent situation, if they're fleeing war, if they're fleeing armed conflict, they of course have the right to move and seek asylum. And so restricting the movement of people who are whose lives are at risk, of course, is hugely problematic. What we've seen is that states have used COVID-19 as a pretext to forego their obligation to guarantee the right to seek asylum. And we've seen, particularly in Europe, the pushing back of boats in the Mediterranean. Although we were seeing this prior to COVID-19, we've been seeing this at an increasing rate since the onset of COVID-19. We've also seen people on the move who are arriving to European shores are being placed, for example, in the case of Malta, are being placed on tourist boats that are no longer doing tourist trips around the Mediterranean. They're being placed on tourist boats and being detained there. Of course, there's pushing back people and withholding their right to seek asylum is a violation of the fundamental principle of non-refoulement, and this is becoming increasingly so with regard to COVID-19. Of course, this is happening also within the context of the criminalization of migrant solidarity. And so where we have ports that are being shut down in Italy, for example, in Malta, Greece also not receiving arrivals. We also have the criminalization of migrant solidarity boats where they, although it's not their responsibility and it never should be to carry out search and rescue missions, they've been doing so in the absence of state activity. And they're also being criminalized for doing that. My second point is with regard to containment. So I don't have so much time to get into border externalization policies, but in brief, they focus on containing people in often unsafe, inhumane environments in third countries where they're exposed to tortures, exposed also to trafficking rings and such. And what we've seen is a doubling down on containment policies, so to keep people out of Europe at all costs so that they don't bring the virus here. Also, containment policies within Europe. So we've seen, for example, the case of Lesbos, the horrific conditions on Lesbos, where a camp, an overcrowded camp with over 12,000 people, which burned down some months back, completely overcrowded and no access to adequate sanitation. And of course, this overcrowding leading to a huge increase in the number of cases of the virus. The same we had in Ireland in the direct provision accommodation centres in Ireland, for example. And also in detention centres where migrants are being held in increased isolation, of course, has huge implications for health as well, and also on mental health. Deportations and forced returns as a third point. Migrants are still being deported or forcefully returned. We saw that in the US, for example, that there was the use of a quarantine law, a very outdated, obscure quarantine law, where people were not even given the right to seek asylum, but were immediately being deported. And under that law, on the 1st of July, 70,000 people had been deported from the US without even seeking access to asylum. They were just immediately sent back. And then my fourth point with regard to borders specifically is on the situation of migrant workers. So we've seen that essential workers are often the most exposed to the virus, but they're often the least likely to have access to health protection and to healthcare, and often those who are in situations of where they're undocumented or in precarious legal situations may indeed fear seeking access to medical care because that may lead to their deportation. And then just very briefly to mention 4 general points that we've seen with regard to COVID-19. So an increase in militarization, which of course has an impact specific to people on the move. We've also seen an increase in digitalization, so a move towards a cashless society, a move towards surveillance, which pushes people out of society who can't perhaps access a bank account and these kinds of things. We've also seen an increase in racist sentiment. So considering that the virus is being brought here by migrants or being brought here by the, naming specific groups that are responsible for the virus. And we've also seen that the border market is booming. So there's an increase in spending in the private sector to fortify our borders. And we've seen that that money is being increasingly given over to third-party private corporations where there is no accountability for how that money is being spent, to the detriment, of course, of spending that same public money on providing healthcare and access for those who need it. That was very quick. I hope I managed to resume in 5 minutes my 4 specific border points and 4 general points. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer afterwards.
Great. And Nivu will come back to you as well, of course, on question 2. Thanks for also pointing to the erosion of rights, the racism, and also the role of private contractors, which we haven't really touched upon otherwise, which John might also touch upon. So John Grayson is a UK-based activist and campaigner with the South Yorkshire Migration and Asylum Action Group. He's also an independent researcher and adult educator. He has written for fora such as Open Democracy, the Institute of Race Relations, on the conditions of life and housing for asylum seekers, as well as on the treatment of asylum seekers under the UK immigration system and throughout Europe during the COVID-19 pandemic. John, I would like to invite you to respond.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. The COVID pandemic brings into focus existing social and political injustices. Certainly this is the case in the UK asylum system. If you look at the UK asylum system, it's pioneered things that other governments in recent years have taken up. As early as the 1990s, there was a decision really to have a brutal deterrent reception policy in the UK. Going back to the private corporations, the British government has always outsourced a large percentage of the asylum business in the UK, very often to security corporations like G4S or Serco or whatever. So they outsourced the violence of the system to private companies. My focus over the years has been on housing, accommodation. And I believe, and I think it's very apparent, in fact, if we think about the British government's creating a hostile environment to make life very uncomfortable as possible for refugees, then the homes that we provide for asylum seekers while they wait for their asylum claim to be determined should really be homes. And what they've turned out to be in the UK is really kind of places where people can be hurt. They can be hurt in terms of the kind of conditions they've got to live in. My own research over the years has shown slum housing as part of the official asylum housing system, rats, cockroaches. And I think this has become a very important part of this kind of hostile environment, hitting people really in their homes and families with the kind of squalid conditions that they're given to live in. COVID, I think, simply locked people into this housing. And for the last few months in the UK, nothing's moved. People haven't moved out of the hostels into asylum housing. They haven't moved out of asylum housing, even if they've got positive results, they're still in asylum housing. I mean, they're about, in my particular area of the country, in Yorkshire, in the north of England, there are around 1,000 people still in an asylum hostel and in hotels, blocked, waiting to go into asylum housing. So the whole system's locked down. The problem is it's locked down in some pretty squalid and life-threatening kind of accommodation. My research for the last year, since January, I've been interviewing over 100 residents or ex-residents of a place called Urban House, which is an initial accommodation centre in Wakefield in Yorkshire, where people should spend 3 to 4 weeks before they go on to asylum housing. They're spending up to 6 months in this place, yeah? The contractors have never really provided a very good hostel to Urban House, but during COVID, they simply ignored all government regulations. There's never been any social distancing attempted in that place. No masks or hand sanitizers have ever been provided until very recently after the campaigning. Toilets and bathrooms are shared and often very unhygienic. People have to share rooms, 3 in a room with strangers in there. And there's no health support to talk of. And most important, there's no cash at all. People don't get any money at all in that situation. Inevitably, given all that, COVID broke out in Urban House, 9th of July with 35 cases. The contractors then responded remarkably, really, and quite appallingly. The day after it broke out, 85 people, 85 residents, were actually just sent out of the centre, untested, although COVID had been discovered the day before, to all parts of the north of England, to asylum housing, without any consultation with local authorities or whatever. So potentially here we had people who may have been infected with COVID, simply distributed around the country. In Birmingham, a very similar centre, with the same contractor actually, similar conditions, inevitably 56 cases of COVID in late August, and that centre was then shut down. So COVID has intensified a hostile environment in the UK asylum system. And this is quite a big issue. There are 50,000 people in asylum housing and hostels at this very moment in the UK.
Thanks, John. Do you want to make a final statement, or can I come back to you?
I think that no, come back to me. I think I'm happy to answer questions.
This is great. I mean, you have really brought home the question for those of us who are based in the UK, and I think it is also very important to have a spotlight on some European and UK practices to avoid the wrong assumption that all of what is bad and all injustices are just taking place in the global south. So I'm really glad also for John and Neve's emphasis on this. I just want to give the opportunity to show the outcome of our audience survey so that we see where people are from. Okay, so everybody should see it on their screen. Lots of academics in here, lots of people based from Europe, and somebody in the audience quite rightly pointed out that when you're from Turkey, it's always very difficult to decide how to categorize yourself, and that is indeed quite right. So I would like to really move on to the second question, because I know that everybody from the speakers really feels very strongly about this. And this is the question: what can and should be done to uphold the rights of migrants and refugees in a pandemic context? And I would like to invite Neve first to respond to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think I found this question actually much more difficult than the first one, but I'll see if I can respond, and hopefully the other speakers will also fill in some of the gaps I might leave. But I think as an immediate response, I'm thinking in terms of public health advice. As we've already heard, that people who are on the move don't have access to public health care in many situations. So of course, guarantee immediate access to public health care, guarantee access to sanitization, that you can have access to water, you can wash your hands, you have access to a mask, all of these things that we're being told to do, but many of us are not in a situation where we can actually implement basic public health guidelines. And of course, the question of social distancing, many people are being confined in housing, as we just heard from John there, where they can't even social distance, you know. And we had this also in Ireland, in the, as I mentioned again, the direct provision centres, where people are in rooms with bunk beds and sleeping 4 to a room. And it's obviously completely impossible to socially distance in this sort of a situation. So this, of course, highlights the situation and the risk exposed by COVID, but it also highlights how fragmented asylum processes are, you know, across the world. And I'm mentioning some European examples because that's where I'm based. But I think also, as we highlighted, many people are migrant workers, for example, people with precarious situation with regard to documentation, are often working in poorly paid jobs. They don't have access to healthcare. If they do access healthcare, they immediately feel that they may be deported. So guarantee immediately their access to healthcare, and also make clear that if they do access healthcare now, once the pandemic has subsided, that the risk to them being deported is not, you know, disconnect that, because you might think, okay, I can access healthcare today, but down the line, will I be deported because of that? Stop deportations. I think we heard from Adriana in Honduras, the situation with deportations. Stop deportations. I think we've already heard of the detrimental effects of that beyond the pandemic, but the deportations in general. Guarantee the right to seek asylum, guarantee humanitarian access, so health, including mental health. People are fleeing violent situations and need immediate access to health and mental health care, and guarantee also access to legal recourse, because we often, during much of the pandemic, processes of asylum that were already ongoing have been halted, and what's happened to those processes and what will happen once that backlog begins to clear. And I think beyond the pandemic, we've been asking ourselves, and Tia and I, some questions around, you know, what can we do with borders and migration and movement as a much broader discussion, because what we're seeing with the pandemic is really only the tip of the iceberg. And, you know, I think we really need to have a much deeper and a much more honest conversation about the kind of world we want to live in, and what do borders mean within that, and do we need border structures, and are borders, as current border policies, they're reinforcing, you know, racist colonialist systems of power and dynamics that, you know, we need to also bring to this discussion, I think, much more fundamental questions about what borders actually do and how they segregate us with regard to color, race, and what sort of a world we want to live in, because I think that beyond the pandemic, we see climate breakdown, we see more people on the move more than ever, and these are questions that really need to be addressed. We also need to address the question of profit. There are companies making massive profits from border policies. I think the last assessment that we had in our research was 17.5 billion euros of profit being made each year in the global borders market. And what could we be doing better with that public money? I think just to mention as a closing point, I'm not so sure how many may have seen the new EU global, the pact on migration that was published in September, but I think it really showed just how deeply at odds the thinking in Brussels is with regard to what we actually need on our borders to make people safer. So yeah, there's some very specific things that we should do right now to increase protection and access to healthcare, and then much more of a broader concern with regard to what do borders mean in today's society, and how can we start also aligning with, for example, anti-racism movements who are bringing down colonialist structures. If we consider borders, modern borders in particular, colonialist structures, we really need to start questioning their functionality in today's society, and if that's the kind of world we really want to live in. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Nivea. You gave us a lot to think about. Like you said, no easy answers there. John, can I invite you to respond to the question, what can we do to uphold the rights of migrants and refugees in this context?
Yeah, first of all, just interesting with the last speaker in terms of what I've described as asylum markets that have developed in this field with the large corporations and companies making vast profits in terms of, I mean, there's actually secondary markets now in terms of selling, asylum camps in Europe. In the city of London, there's a asset management company there that owns a company that has asylum camps in Switzerland, in Germany, etc. Buying and selling these kind of camps on international secondary markets. I mean, I think it's our job as researchers, academics, and in my case, an activist campaigner, to expose this, to actually get it out there. Because I don't actually think that most people understand the way, well, asylum markets work, but the way the system works at all. And I think that as an academic activist researcher embedded in a social movement, with a large majority of the people in SciMag who actually have experienced the brutal kind of asylum system in the UK, I think COVID has actually pushed the asylum rights issue much, much more below the radar than it was before. It's been very difficult to raise issues in the UK around the conditions in places like Urban House I've talked about before, but generally the kind of conditions that asylum seekers are facing in the UK. And I think that we should all, and I'm sure this happens already, certainly people on the panel have indicated that it does, that I think researchers and activists ought to commit to resourcing, solidarity campaigning alongside those in the asylum system, because that's what my organisation has done for many years. And I think that it's crucial that our skills as researchers, our skills as academics, as journalists sometimes, are used to, in good social movement terms, to resource action, activity, and to research background, to campaigning, etc. So I think that's one thing that maybe we ought to all consider. I'm sure practically all of us are doing it already. I'm not suggesting we're not, but I think it's something we ought to build on. I'd also like to raise the issue of refugees themselves as agents of change, because I don't think anyone's mentioned this one. During my research in Yorkshire on accommodation, etc., a relatively small part of the world, but for the first time in 10 years of research, I observed, and many friends, in a kind of grassroots movement that started inside the hotels, inside Urban House, where people organised direct action to protest about conditions, about everything from food to waiting too long to sometimes quite desperate attempts to move the system in some way. Sittings of 100 people, sittings in a hotel of 120 people, petitions to the Home Office, signed petitions to the Home Office identifying themselves, which I've never seen. So COVID, sort of forced people to the extreme where they've been taking action, and I think that's, if anything's going to change in terms of asylum rights, in terms of the system, then I think that refugees themselves, the migrants themselves, will be active agents in that change. And I think, again, it's a matter of resourcing, supporting, and working alongside those agents of change.
Thanks.
Sorry?
No, thanks. Sorry, do you want to?
Yeah. I just wanted two final comments, if I may.
Yes, of course.
Ironically, I mean, we had an example from Mexico about the closure of detention centres. And actually, in my organisation has been campaigning, along with many other organisations in the UK, for the closure of detention centres. We don't see their purpose or whatever. And in the pandemic, the Home Office emptied most of the detention centres. A notorious one that people even abroad might have heard of, Yarlswood detention centre for women, was emptied. And in a sense, we'd won that campaign. You could see that they didn't need those detention centres, or I think they're now using them as holding centres for people, new kind of
Arrivals
migrants
by
and
boat,
refugees.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, we haven't got rid of them, but their purpose is different. And, we show that that's immigration removal function that they said, it's nonsense anyway. But so that was kind of, I suppose, a slight bright spot that we showed you can do without detention centres. But I think just to sum up, I firmly believe with my friends in the asylum system that the only, this famous kind of phrase, the only rights we have are the ones we fight for.
Mm.
And I think that's my perspective on this question.
Thank you, John. That's a really important point. But as Niamh also said, of course, some solidarity has been criminalized, which is very damning also to that kind of solidarity that's important. Yeah.
Because it's so effective. Yeah, that's right.
Adriana, you would like to respond as well, I think.
So in this question, I have 4 points. First one, I think that we need to identify the main critical nodes for the protection of the rights of migrants and build different profiles of vulnerability. We need to understand the diversity of migration and give response that are more adjusted to the realities of the migrant population. From the social science, we must generate evidence on who needs what and promote innovation in public policy. For the reason the REGIT project is very important and represents a good opportunity for promote an inclusive development agenda based on gender inequalities in society that are in their demographic bonus. Two, I think that we need to promote a better transnational coordination to attend these critical issues. We need more inclusive alliance between governments, international cooperation, civil society, academia, and other actors. That is not easy task, but we cannot forget that global issues such as COVID and migration, we need robust international action in both financial and technical terms, not just political speech with good intention. So in this reason, we need to reinforcement the international actions. Three, generate response to the welfare crisis in Central America. This situation have been complicated by the COVID and worsened by the climatic change. The Eta hurricane have several challenges for Nicaragua and Honduras, and it will be the hurricane Mitch last decades. This crisis is already generating new waves of migrants, and these migrants will face more barriers than in the past. In this scenario, we need to have a package of ideas for promote the right to migrate of the people, but the right to stay in the region too. This is important to understand the different responsibility that the countries have in the immigration problems. And the fourth point is referred to promote a digital agenda that include the migrant population, because the digital response is very important in the new scenario of COVID and the new normality, but there are no connections of service to migrant population. So we need to include the migrants in the whole agenda that we have in the job, in the health and education service that are the digitalized in more accelerated way in all times.
Thank you. I think Pia, would you take over from Adriana? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, we'll continue some of the points that Adriana made. I think, I mean, we should agree that all governments in Latin America and elsewhere have legal and ethical obligations under international law to safeguard the rights of migrants and to ensure the best possible provision of services, including the right to health for all. But what COVID exposed is distinctive situations of socioeconomic, physical, and legal zones of blurred responsibility. So who should care? Who cares? Why to care? And also who falls in the cracks of those responsibilities. So that's why I want to go back to that claim need of understanding the gender and ethnic dimension of the displaced and the rights of the displaced, because they are not a homogeneous lot. So looking at what happened what is happening in Venezuela, and back to 2015, when there was a mass exodus from Venezuela, we see that at that point, 2015, there was an increase to 65% of maternal death in the country. And it's not coincidence that half of the population leaving Venezuela, migrating, displaced from Venezuela, are actually women and girls. And actually women and girls who were living in the border just up to the moment of giving birth to cross to Brazil or Colombia to give birth, and in the hope that they will leave. So these are not necessarily economic migrants, and these are not refugees escaping persecution or persecution rather. So there's no economic sense to the understanding of migration, and it's very difficult to classify them as refugees. They don't even look for refugees as a status. So they are in a legal limbo, and that also affects their possibilities to regularize a situation that allow them to formal employment or reliable shelters or public health services. So Venezuelan in particular are in a very, very distinctive blur situation, as I mentioned before. So that's just one example, but based on the discussion in general that we had today, I think states should suspend the laws that limit migrants and refugees access to healthcare services, and those laws that affect their access to economic support programs, and take urgent measures to end that forced returns that we mentioned and deportations that we mentioned before. Stop using migration policies to actually deal with political decisions or political priorities. Counter the xenophobia that undermines migrants' rights to health and rights in general, and establish access to public funds, especially for those migrants affected by the loss of income, but also those who never really actually access to formal employment or reliable services or protection. So the final point is that there is a need for more effective monitoring of the human rights situations of displaced people and migrants and returnees as well during COVID and afterwards. And international and regional organizations should really play a central role on this and avoid those situations of socioeconomic, physical, and legal zones of blur responsibility that I mentioned before.
Great, thank you so much. I hear some resonance as well as some really great new ideas. Emily, I think you're the last one of the group answering this question.
Great, thank you. And I think what we're hearing from all of the speakers is that we need change on a systemic level. That it's not about individuals or how individuals are engaging with refugees and migrants, but about the systems that are perpetuating these problems and that have been exposed by COVID. And I think we're in a tough moment to make systemic change. We're fighting xenophobia and nationalism. Niv raised the point that border policies are in a dark place, and she used the US, which is my country, as an example. But even before the pandemic became an excuse, the US policies regarding asylum were xenophobic and exclusionary, and refugees were being sent back to Mexico. That wasn't something new that happened with COVID. It was something that was happening that got challenged in court, and then COVID provided an opportunity to use a different legal grounds for continuing the same xenophobic and anti-asylum approaches. And Adriana raised also that this is very complex, right? She raised the connection between the decrease in available resources coupled with the economic limitations on refugees and migrants accessing the workforce. So our response has to be systemic. At the same time, we've also seen this year how much public movements can impact and drive systemic responses. And so when we're thinking about what we can all do, that piece of it should be remembered. That's what we can do in our individual capacity, is to be part of the public movement for systemic change. And I think when we're looking at what are the things that need to change, really I see 3 things, and then how, I see 2. So 1, what needs to change? I think we have an opportunity here to end the use of immigration detention. We see Mexico making some strides to that, although it's very up and down. So we're still fighting to get that judicial order enacted. We see Thailand has continued with something that predated COVID, but isn't a step toward really one of the first systems in Southeast Asia that would recognize refugees and give them a legal status that would keep them from being detained. We've heard John's story about what's possible in UK. This is a moment to say, this won't be our last pandemic. Detention centers are not useful. They're not effective. They're not any more effective for identifying who is in your country or making sure that people turn up at asylum court proceedings. And they're dangerous, not just for the people in detention, but for everybody, right? They contribute to public health negative outcomes. So that's one. Second is continuing to push for refugee inclusion in economies. We have the example of essential workers. We're facing the challenge that the world economy is likely going to be more stretched, but we also have seen the importance of refugee and migrant workers in our economies to keep things running when we face challenges. And so I think there's an opportunity for that. And the third is to build on the bright spots of that we've seen with regard to refugee inclusion, right? We've seen that detention and segregation doesn't work, and we've seen that denial of services is harmful to everyone. In addition to what we've seen in Mexico and Thailand and those bright spots with regard to detention, we've seen that Singapore, for example, and various other countries learned some stark lessons. Singapore had gotten the virus under control, but it didn't include migrant workers in its public health prevention measures. And then the pandemic had a resurgence among migrant workers because they weren't included in national healthcare systems. And so I think we have an opportunity to build on the lessons and to move forward. And in terms of how, I think we really need to make sure that governments with the resources to do so are investing in advocacy and policy change and human rights defense in places where refugees are. And that's predominantly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, right? Those are the regions that host the vast majority of the world's refugees. And there are refugees fighting for their human rights, fighting for inclusion in national health systems, fighting for access to the economy and the opportunity to contribute. We need to be resourcing those activists. We need to be resourcing those people who are making change. And at the same time, of course, in the global north needs to fix its own asylum and refugee human rights, migrant rights systems in order to have legitimacy. So I think those are really the next steps for us, and the steps that we all can play a role in both creating political will for, and making sure that the research and the solutions development, the solutions piloting is undertaken in ways that get us to that get us to the right details of the solutions that we're looking for. So we need our academics to be identifying how do we want refugees included in the economy or included in the national healthcare system. How do we do that in ways that actually work? How do we avoid making avoidable mistakes? And how do we make sure that when we have the political will, that we then implement solutions that are workable?
Great. Thank you so much for all those rich answers. We got also a range of really interesting questions, and I'm hoping I get to as many as I can. I will just be picking some and summarizing them shortly for everybody. You don't have to respond to every question, so just pick one that you find interesting. So I'm going to start with Adam's question here, which I'm going to rephrase slightly or paraphrase slightly just to make it a bit shorter, but people can read it as well. Adam raises the very valid point that in the event, we have kind of so far put migrants and refugees on one pile, but of course, between migrants and refugees, there may be considerable differences along social and economic dimensions as well as legal dimensions. I know some of you work more on refugees and others work more with migrants. And of course, also this distinction has been challenged by a lot of critical migration research and activists. So I just would like to invite you, whoever wants to respond, as I said, not everybody has to respond, any of the speakers who wants to say something about, is it meaningful to perhaps distinguish more carefully between the impact on migrants and refugees and how we should uphold their rights? Neve, yeah.
Maybe I'll go. I think that in T&I we've tended to use people on the move, because I think when you get into labeling refugees and migrants, you often end up putting people in boxes, and often what you find is that when you almost create a categorization whereby you think that refugees are somehow more deserving than migrants in with regard to access, I think. And I think you're entering into dangerous territory there, because we see so many migrants or refugees or people on the move, or however, whichever term you want to use, they're on the move because, for example, they're fleeing economic violence, they're fleeing machista violence, they're fleeing types of violence that maybe aren't codified in the Refugee Convention, because it's quite an old document. And so I think that when you get into labeling, also I think what we heard from Pia, how do you refer to women who are leaving Venezuela to give birth in Colombia or in Brazil? So I think that we tend to try and not enter into very specific labels and use people on the move. And where we have to choose, I think we would probably choose refugees, because most of the time we see that people who have refugee status have greater access to rights. And who are we to say, well, your asylum plea is more valid than this person because you're fleeing a recognized armed conflict, whereas you are fleeing a criminal gang, for example, which is often the case. If you're leaving Central America, you may be, oh, well, you're fleeing a criminal gang, whereas if you're fleeing a place where there's a recognized armed conflict, oh, well, you're fleeing a recognized armed group. So I think, I think we would definitely suggest that moving away from restrictive labels and being more fluid in our understanding of who's moving and why is what we need going forward, I think.
Could I just jump in on that? And I think that was a very nicely put by Niam, so I don't need to say much. And I mentioned the case of women fleeing Venezuela, because there is there are some scholars talking about fleers of necessity, and it is exactly that. It says these are not economic migrants. These are not migrants that decide to go. They are forced migrants, but they are not being forced because of political or religion or even conflict. Although there are many conflicts in Venezuela, but there's an element of well-being and necessity and harm and being alive that is a good indicator of specific displaced people. And I think that that brings the issue of understanding and framing. But this takes me, and this is the point that I want to make now, there is also a structure of responsibility that is not clear. Who should care? And that structure of responsibility tends to be biased towards states. And we know what happens when states are also biased. So I think there is that second question about the structure of responsibility that is important for the governance of the issues that we are mentioning. Thank you.
I also think to the extent that we have rules, laws, international human rights laws that apply to refugees, and yet refugees' human rights are routinely and egregiously violated, that when we think about that as one group, and you could talk about other groups of migrants as well, if we can't make those words on paper into a reality in people's daily lives, then what makes us think that passing new instruments that say that more people have rights, what makes us think those will be anything more than words on paper either? And in particular, when it comes to Latin America and the Venezuelans that you talk about, Pia, I mean, especially under the Cartagena Declaration's definition of a refugee, when you talk about a breakdown in public order, I think there is an extremely good legal argument that many people in Latin America, from Venezuela, from places in Central America, Mesoamerica, do qualify as refugees. But governments are saying, we will not recognize those people as refugees, and we're letting them get away with it. And so we, at the same time that we need to be saying, yes, there are people who are falling through the cracks, who are not covered by our existing protections, we also need to say, you as a government can't keep narrowing this existing protection until it goes away. That's not okay. We're going to use this protection for everybody we can possibly apply it to, and then we're going to see who's falling through the cracks and, you know, find a way to get them included as well. And I think that is something, you know, we've seen in Latin America, particularly in places like Colombia and Ecuador, that these definitions are just being, the governments are constricting definitions or refusing to apply definitions that they have agreed to in ways that I think we have an obligation to fight. As John said, if the only rights you have are the ones you fight for.
Could I add just a little to that? I think these, you know, semantic arguments on the surface are pretty crucial, because states actually set the terms, don't they? I mean, in the UK, the hostile environment is aimed at so-called illegals immigration. Now, you know, that's the state defining who are illegal and who are bona fide refugees. We have a problem again in terms of so-called foreign criminals. If someone, an asylum seeker, works in the UK, is illegal to work, and they have a prison sentence, they then become a foreign criminal and, you know, can be deported, etc. So I think, you know, we have to contest the definition that the state is raising on these issues. I like the people on the move thing, actually. I think that's quite a good way of just saying we don't want people labelled in that way. It's dangerous, and it can threaten their lives to be declared illegal.
Yeah. Sara, I want to add some aspect. I think that in Mesoamerica, in legal terms, the refugees have a different status from other migrants. But in society with more lacks of welfare, like my region, the legal status is not relevant in, for example, in access a job, health, and education. So there are vulnerabilities that refugees have in the same proportion that migrants. The principal difference, I think, is that the refugee seekers wait a resolution and they are trapped in this situation. The other migrants can keep moving, right? But the seekers of refugees, they need to stay in a place that authority can have contact. So the refugees needs a resource for to keep waiting, and resource when their application is rejected, because in these areas the time of wait can be prolonged more, and with the COVID situation, this time of wait is more longer than in the past.
Great. I have the difficult task to pick some more questions, and I see some upvoting happening. Okay, so there's a clear winner at the moment. I'm just going to paraphrase the question quickly for everybody. So the question initially asked was whether to what extent COVID-19 has increased hostility towards migrants among host populations, either exacerbating negative attitudes, but also reducing the support of groups that normally show solidarity because they might want to avoid the disease and therefore be less engaged. And at the same time, somebody else added to that question, could it be that COVID could have a positive impact on people's felt sense of solidarity, because being confined, or the shared experience of being confined to certain spaces and a lack of mobility that COVID has had on many of us, could also perhaps be a foundation for future advocacy. So just to kind of rephrase really quickly, has COVID, you think, increased hostility towards migrants, or do the effects of COVID-19 also perhaps give some sense of a foundation for the right to mobility as being important shared for everybody? I'm aware of time, so any responses, please keep them concise.
Can I just kick off very quickly? It is clear that xenophobia and discrimination increased to enormous proportions because of COVID, but mainly as well because of the attitudes of governments. You know, we have in Brazil, for example, Bolsonaro saying that they are going to leave the Migration Refugee Compact because they are absolutely useless as international frameworks, and therefore the message is we don't care about these migrants or refugees. And not only we don't care, because they are on the move, they are displaced, they are actually the carriers of the virus. So so that's why we're going to close the borders, so don't let them in. So the otherness, you know, just to put it in some sort of fancy concept, is a real thing, and it becomes real not only for those who are either stuck waiting for the refugee status, like Adriana mentioned, those who are actually in the formal system, or those who are actually forced to return back because of the border closure or because of deportation. I mean, the centers that closed in Mexico meant that many Guatemalans had to return to Guatemala. Maybe they decided to go back, but all those hundreds of Guatemalans returnees were actually hugely segregated in Guatemala because they were seen as not only failing as migrants, but also carrying the COVID or the virus to their own country. So it's very complex, and there are many different aspects to this.
Great.
And I would say that there's probably a link with the increased polarization online, and as COVID has forced people to be living more of their lives digitally, we saw that there was already increased polarization online. In the US, in certain ways, for asylum access, we have had more people in the US interested in supporting refugees and migrants, taking a pro-refugee and migrant attitude in response to outrage at the Trump administration's xenophobic and cruel and inhumane policies. So we have seen that the impact has been actually the opposite, maybe a little bit more along the lines of, you know, people feeling their own freedoms restricted or their own ability to move restricted, and having sympathy for others. You know, at the same time, we've seen that in Malaysia, public sentiment against refugees has been manipulated by the government. COVID may have played a role in that, but really this was an intentional manipulation by the government using the digital spaces that we all live in to shift from what used to be a very positive response on the part of the Malaysian public particularly toward Rohingya refugees, who are fellow Muslims, shifting that to a much more anti-refugee attitude. And that was a deliberate play by the Malaysian government that has resulted in that change. They may have found COVID an opportunity to use, and they also may have benefited from people living a larger percentage of their lives online during COVID. But again, COVID's not the cause. The cause really is the current Malaysian government's interest in generating support for its anti-refugee policies.
I think anybody at York University, and obviously I'm active in Sheffield, would remember the early days with the attacks in the streets on Chinese students and in supermarkets and God knows what. You know, really terrible kind of atmosphere at that time. And also, I think on the wider level, there's certainly near where I live in West Yorkshire, there's significant British Asian settlement. And on the streets, people actually blame those people for the spread of COVID, saying, oh, well, they live in 3-generation households, overcrowded, etc. And at one point, the British government actually brought in very severe restrictions on house gatherings. On the night before Eid, you know, the celebration after Ramadan, and then people saying, well, don't cancel Christmas. In effect, the British government cancelled the Muslim kind of Christmas. So I must admit, I'm very depressed about the effect of COVID on relations in communities, certainly in the areas where I live. And it's, but I think I'd take up the point someone made about the politicians. I think politicians create a lot of this. I don't think it's some kind of grassroots racist movements and things. I think it's the way they frame the whole issues, which then lead people to take action or change their minds or views towards a kind of racist position. And I would certainly blame the rhetoric and the kind of atmosphere that's being created by politicians.
Maybe just one very small point before we finish on just picking up on John's last point about framing. I think it's key because so I think we've seen since 2011, maybe beforehand, but I think an increase in the last 10 or so years, the framing of people on the move as a securitized problem, so that there's a securitization of a problem stemming from, I suppose, in Europe, the Arab Spring, and then kind of securitizing the problem, and then the solution is a military one. And I think built into that often is this racist undercurrent that people coming from overseas, coming from elsewhere, wherever that may be, are a problem, and that the solution is a militarized one, is a hostile one, which in the case of the UK, they've come out and said very clearly they will create a hostile environment. So I think the question of framing is really important, I think, as well, to understanding the policies from top down.
I think that there was one other question that was voted up, and as we only have 5 minutes, I would ask you to just respond with like 1 or maybe maximum 3 words. And that was the question that was asked by Oscar, which was, what field of research do you think we need to focus on in regards to the impact of COVID on migrants and refugees, so that it can aid human rights practitioners and activists? So what's the field of research that really needs our attention right now in order to support activists and practitioners in the field? Just in a few words, please. Thank you so much.
I can say a few words taken from Leonor Teixeira, who is actually saying, or highlighting that it's not necessarily a field, is the approach that we need, and the lens, and the intersectional approach. The intersectional lens is critical for an inclusive and sustainable, actually, response. So I don't know if it's a field. It needs to be interdisciplinary, interinstitutional, and intersectional lens.
Perfect, thank you.
Sara, I need to say that the response that need to be connected with the different public policy issues, because we need to know who needs what, and the difference between the vulnerability of migrants. They are not equals. They need something issues that need a special public policy. Not we cannot put the all migrants in all reset or responses, right?
Right.
And building on bright spots is only possible when we have research that shows how and why the bright spots work and encourages other countries to take them up. And we also need to be identifying what refugee-led or refugee and host community-led movements are most effective in the countries where refugees are, to change this reality, to improve this reality, to change host country policies and practices. So we need to get out of our rooms in the global north and be doing research with refugee academics, with host community academics, looking at refugee and host community-led movements.
Thanks. Niamh and John, can you do it in 3 to 5 words, or?
I think I'd just echo that last one. I think to research the social movements who are actually trying to change things in terms of, the status of refugees, etc., and to see what succeeds and what doesn't. And I think you can only do that from inside the organisation. So I think some really intensive kind of research in those organisations and movements.
Great.
Yeah, very quickly, I think in T&I we will continue to focus our research kind of where we have already. So the border industrial complex, the private companies benefiting from this, who's making the money. Also continue to look at the securitization of borders, so be that through militarization or digitalization of borders, and also looking through a neo-colonialist lens, I think, because a lot of the power dynamics that we see playing out are dynamics that we already have a historical relationship with. So yeah, very, very short, brief comment.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. I mean, thank you for this incredibly rich panel. I really enjoyed your inputs. I think there were so many interesting ideas, and I hope this is not the end of our conversation. In order also for us to take it forward, I just want to let the audience know that we will make a page on the IGDC website where we collect some of the resources that the panelists of today have already produced with their respective organizations or university institutes. I also want to thank Tara and Jessica for supporting the organization of this event, as well as IGDC, of course, the Festival of Social Science and the Migration Network. We also have Polly in the audience here, who will be writing up a blog post on the basis of this event and a short report, which we will be sharing with people. So again, if you're interested in a follow-up, keep an eye on the IGDC website. Yeah, so thank you so much. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the questions, the answer and the not answered, but very interesting to see the engagement. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for organizing this. Been very good.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.